Okay, everyone, please take your seats. We're getting ready to start our very first panel. Grab your drinks and nibbles. Okay, everyone, we're very excited to start our very first panel this morning. The title of the panel is Fascism's Colonial Roots. And we have with us today Bernie, Perley, Rueben, George, and Peter Hudson. In the interest of time, we're not going to read full bios for everyone, but you can find, as Naomi and others have mentioned, the full bios in the program. These are truly extraordinary human beings who've done remarkable things, and so nothing that I will say here will do justice to that. We're going to have Bernie come up and speak first, followed by Rueben, and then Peter. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes to give their presentation, and then we will immediately open things up for questions and discussion from and with the audience. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Bernie Perley, who is Maliseet from Tobique First Nation and the director of the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies at UBC. He's an artist and writer whose work focuses on Indigenous language revitalization and Indigenous resurgence against genocide. Bernie is going to speak to us about the ways that colonialism manifests as fascism's twin. Bernie, take it away. Thank you.
Dungok. I said, good morning, everybody. How are you? Thumbs up? All right, excellent. Louise O'Barney Perley, Woolistugri Ngutguk Nil, Naga Wabanakyo. My name is Bernie Perley. I come from Tobique First Nation in New Brunswick, and I'm also Wabanaki. We are the people of the dawn. Like Leanne Simpson indicated, our word for dawn is Chquaban. And so it does, in a similar way, collapse kind of temporal aspects of Western notions of time so that the past, the present, and the future are all, indicated within the word Chquaban. But the most important thing about the word Chquaban is that it is also the name we give our confederacy. We are the people of the dawn. And so for me, I'm delighted to be here as a guest in the traditional ancestral unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam peoples. And I look forward to learning more and more about these ancestral lands as I continue my work at the University of University of British Columbia. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? So when you look at the list of all the prominent speakers here, and we have stellar scholars and activists that are going to be sharing their thoughts with you, what am I doing on this particular list? I'm a scholar and an activist for language revitalization in Indigenous communities. And the other day, Thursday afternoon, my esteemed colleague, Glenn Coulthard, came into my office and he said, so what are you going to talk about on Saturday? And he has every right to question why I would be included in these particular conversations, because I am not a political scientist. I am not a scholar on fascism. So what the hell am I doing here? And so one of the things I told him immediately was that, well, what I'm going to do is say that I'm worried that all our preoccupations about fascism is something that is more recent, that it's happening now. And so what I'm going to indicate is that fascism has deep colonial roots. And so that it's not just something that started in the 30s and that reappears in the third decade of the 21st century. No, this has a long trajectory. Okay, so Glenn, I said what I was going to say. That's it. But what else is going on here? And so for me, this is one of the things that I want to kind of alert everybody to in terms of how we begin to think about fascism and its colonial roots. So I really appreciate Toscano's book on late fascism. And so the idea of framing this particular moment as like fascism indicates that there are other periods of fascism. There's perhaps a middle and there's perhaps an early. Would the middle be the 1930s? What would be the early? Well, I would suggest that the early fascism started in October 12th, 1492. One of the most important entries in Columbus's journal was the observation that he encountered humans with all the qualities that humans are given. But in that same paragraph, what he decides to do is to deny indigenous peoples their linguistic sovereignty. He was going to bring them back to Spain so that they may learn to speak. He denied them their religious sovereignty. They're going to be good Christians. And he denied them their personal sovereignty. They would make good slaves. That entry was the introduction of fascism to Native North America and all the American continents. And so this is where, for me, one of the things we need to think about is where these ideas come from. So for me, as a scholar on language and recognizing that the process of fascism is to expel any kind of language or any ideas or any experiences that are deemed dangerous to the authorities. And so where does this idea come from? I want to share with you this image. Is the image already up? Yes. Okay. Okay, so for me, this is a representation from John Martin, painted in 1841. It's called Pandemonium. And so he was inspired by John Milton's Paradise Lost. In book one, this is where John Milton imagined what hell would look like when Lucifer and all his fellow angels and other demons were cast into hell. And so Lucifer had to find a capital by which he could then collect all his followers. And so pandemonium is the gathering of all demons. And we're seeing pandemonium in Washington, D.C., in the White House. And so which brings me to this particular image. And so here we are with the painting of American Progress. This was painted by John Gast in 1872. It's a celebration of American manifest destiny. You can see the light on the right side of the image and chasing away the darkness on the left side of the image. This is where the indigenous peoples and the wild animals are fleeing from the goddess of progress, American progress. And so, again, this narrative is being reiterated in the White House. But this is a narrative that is being shared across the globe as well. And so these are some of the things that we have to pay attention to in the kind of long arc of fascism. One of the things what can I say that hasn't been said before? And so I want to thank Naomi for that excellent introduction. Naomi, you stole my thunder, I have to tell you that. And so what can I offer this conversation now that we have this kind of framing for the long arc of fascism? And let me put it this way. As I was thinking about this, here we are gathered with like minds, like interests, and like advocacies. And so in some ways, it's a celebration of how we're coming together to resist this kind of new movement, this boomerang effect of fascism. But one thing that I do worry about is we cannot be complacent about our self-satisfaction in terms of our advocacy. And so as I'm thinking about this, then if we have three different periods of fascism from late to middle to early, then is it possible there are also qualities of fascism that we have to be attentive to? And so as I was thinking about this, there's one quality that we all recognize is an immediate danger to all of us, and that is malignant fascism. This is a disease that's spreading through the body politic. It's not going to be contained in the border between the United States and Canada. It's happening here. And so that malignant fascism is something we have to be on guard about. But there's another one that we need to be really attentive to, and that's what I call benign fascism. And in benign fascism is a disposition towards kindness. Are we in this room, through our activities, guilty of benign fascism? And so here we are speaking colonial languages in a city called Vancouver, talking about an invasive idea called fascism, where Indigenous peoples are still struggling to maintain their languages, trying to reinscribe their traditional stories and place names in their ancestral lands. Let us not forget that benign fascism also has blind spots. Thank you.
Hi, again. So my Uncle Lee wrote a paper, and he explained how it took the colonizers 2,000 years to colonize themselves. And in the process, in a period of time, they killed 80,000 women, taking away the matriarchal system. And what he explained is how they severed that connection. And that's what I was talking about earlier this morning. What was that connection? What did they sever? How I look at it is how we lived in harmony. You know, like my grandfather, Chief Dan George, he was a famous actor and poet and humanitarian. He went to residential school, born 1899, he went to residential school in 1904. And he lived in a community that no matter what, he had somebody taking care of him 100% of the time when he was a child. Aunties, uncles, grandparents, everybody taking care of him. And he left that to a place that didn't have anything like that. And my brother explained how it's hard to adapt and to come out of something so horrific. One of the teachers told me that the foundation that we all have is the foundation that was given to us between the age of birth and 10 years old. So he left that place at 5 years old, 4 years old, and went to residential school. One of the first things he experienced was he couldn't speak English. For a couple of days, they felt he wasn't trying, so they cut off his finger. And that was his first experience of residential school, leaving a place where he's loved and taken care of 100% of the time, then punished for what he didn't know was to speak the language. And then when he came home after residential school, colonization still continued, because he walked from just across the water there all the way up to Indian Arm, looking for the longhouse that he lived in, that he was a part of, where it was a communal community that lived together, and he couldn't find it. And he walked all the way back. And just when he was going to give up, his grandma came out of the house and said, "Son, we're here." And he goes, where's our home? He said, "We live here now." And he goes, "Why is it a white home? Where's our home?" So everything that he lived for, what he thought, not only from what he'd been through, what he was hoping that he would come back to, changed. And that's still the system that's carrying on today. And but there's tools that we use to help ourselves. When I met how I met Ashira, she's a beautiful lady that was a journalist in Palestine, and she's one of the main people that they followed in that movie where olive trees weep. And how we met was in a place like this. We just finished watching her movie, and she came out, and she walked right up to me, and she hugged me, and she goes, "Brother, I love you, and we are the same. We are the same." And she said, when we're hurt and we're down and we're out and everything is against us, we get up, we sing, we dance, we pray. And that's what we do. And so what they try to sever is that exactly thing that I'm talking about, is our connection to spirit. And that's what I was explaining this morning, the connection. We could look at and analyze, and we do, to figure it out, to backtrack, because that's how healing happens. It's layers of onion, and what you're hearing today is layers that we have to peel off. So what Trump is doing, and even what Canada is doing, what Canada has done, and what they both continue to do, not just here, but globally, like I explained in Scotland when I was there, or Germany, or in South America, they're killing people for speaking up for their voice, of who they are, to protect the land, water, and human rights, go and abide by their teachings that tell them to do so. So we look at all that, but what I keep coming back to when I think of what Uncle Lee was saying, and he said, 2,000 years for the colonized to colonize themselves, the colonizers to colonize themselves, killing 80,000 women for a period of time to sever that connection. The connection to what? And that's what I was explaining, that ecosystem. But now you look at Trump and the generations of his family doing what they've been doing and creating the havoc that they've been doing and continue to exist in their spiritual ecosystem that does the opposite of what I'm talking about. That's what I keep coming back to. What did they want to sever? And look at all the different multiple ways. Have you seen my beautiful sister Naomi Klein's presentation about the history of it and how it continues to happen? But where did it start, I think of? And even when we're born, we get a chance. A little baby born with no prejudice, no anger, no hate, no judgment. Some of these things are inherited, but that's our chance to try to grow them to be something different from what the previous parents, grandparents, or ancestors experienced. Those fundamental teachings I talk about is how we're supposed to raise them into something that's better. And that's what I did with my kids. God, when they turned 18, they started traveling to places that I was worried. He said, "Where are you going, son?" "I'm going to Peru." And I said, "Are you kidding me? There's almost a revolution going on there." "What, you crazy?" He goes, I'm doing what you taught me, Dad." And I said, "How come this is the only time you listen?" But they do that. My nephews and nieces do that. My family does it. My mom does that. Our community does that. My spiritual community does that. That's what we do. That's the message that I bring. It's let's look far back. And like Canada and the U.S. is a cultureless. People say, "Where are you from?" "I'm from Canada." "No, where are you from? Tell me where you're from." We went to Scotland. Big reason why I did a book tour there is I wanted to connect with the 20% of Scottish that I am. I did, and they welcomed me with bagpipes. They welcomed me into the culture and said, "Welcome back to the family, welcome back to the clan." I went to our McDougall Castle and started to figure out, and what I didn't know, because it's glamorized in the way, the Scottish accent, all this stuff, is they went to the same thing. They went to the same thing, residential schools and everything like that. But I started to figure out who I am, again, like I did for our Indigenous community and where I'm from in my Indigenous community. I started figuring it out there too. And I think that's a big key. And not only is it a big key, but it feeds you. You create your ecosystem that feeds you, that gives you strength and courage. And I'm sorry for saying this, but when I'm put in rooms, I don't want to swear, but I'm going to. They put me in rooms where, I'm against people that create these laws, that create this destruction. And I'm talking to them, but, through ceremony, I teach myself to give no fucks. That I'm going to stand in the strength and power and courage of faith that I believe in, because our humanity for earth and people deserve that. They deserve that. We deserve that. Safety. Look at the wars that are happening. Look at everything just horrible happening for what? But it started somewhere, and we have to figure it out. And even for ourselves, what do we need to figure out to make ourselves better, to create what we want? Kinder Morgan was just 3 of us. And it got to a point that 72% of Burnaby residents supported the Tsleil-Waututh Nation in stopping it. And all the work that we do, and the odds are against us, but we have to find a way. All my teachers have a spiritual room, and they sit in it and meditate in it until they find a way. Or find a way to fix their family, their community, to make a difference in the world. They find a way, because they did. They did, and it took them 2,000 years to do that. And what we're going to hear today is how we're unraveling that, but individually unravel it ourselves to see how we can move forward and make a better difference. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to invite next Peter Hudson. Peter is Associate Professor in the Department of Geography at UBC, and his current projects include a global history of racial capitalism and an intellectual and political history of Pan-Africanism. Peter is going to share some of that work with us today. Thank you, Peter.
All right, good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation to be here, to be on this panel, and to be in this space. I think it's important to acknowledge the point about 1492. I think this is a really important historical convergence for where we are today. Of course, it's we can talk about the history of indigenous genocide from 1492, but we can also talk about the rise of both anti-Islam and anti-Semitism in 1492, as well as the birth of anti-blackness. And I think that kind of triangulation of forces is important. And we see it today in places like in the names of some of the places that are inscribed here, like the province of British Columbia. Why are we named this province, I mean, first of all, after the British Empire, but then after Christopher Columbus, or the University of British Columbia? And I think, for me, one of the things I've also realized, if you look at some of the street names here, like Trutch Street, Joseph Trutch brings together, I think, an important convergence of indigenous history and African history, because on one level he's part of one of the architects of indigenous dispossession in the province. On another level, he comes from a family of slave traders or slave owners in Jamaica. And so I think it's important to keep in mind the history of anti-fascism is also the history of the alliances between Black and indigenous peoples. Now, I want to start, that was just a preamble, but I really want to start my presentation today by stating that I am not representing my employer in any shape or fashion. And that I speak as a historian, and as a historian, I am not advocating any particular action, but I am describing how those in the past thought about and responded to certain situations. I also want to say that while my talk is titled Pan-Africanism and Anti-Fascism, I will not be talking only about Pan-Africanism or Pan-Africanists. Instead, I will be referencing a range of Black responses to fascism that emerged from Black intellectuals and activists aligned with Pan-Africanism, but also those who were communists, socialists, and anarchists. And I think the key to what I'm trying to say today is that the people who have given us the real analysis of fascism have been this group of scholars. Now, I understand there are serious theoretical differences and conflicts between these groups. I also recognize that there are serious ideological splinterings within these groups. The communists thought the Pan-Africanists were nothing more than petite bourgeois nationalists. The Pan-Africanists thought the communists were brainwashed Stalinists. The anarchists saw the socialists as liberals, and the socialists saw the anarchists as immature adventurists. As for the liberals, they add nothing to the conversation on anti-fascism, except as prime examples for understanding how fashion can emerge without contest. And I will, however, say a word about them in a second. Now, despite their differences, I want to suggest that the Pan-Africanists, the Black communists, the Black socialists, and the Black anarchists share certain commonalities when it comes to understanding fascism and anti-fascism. And it is a number of those commonalities that I want to briefly discuss today. First, there is indeed a long arc of fascism, and the historical figure or metaphor of the arc demands that we see fascism does not appear as a break, a rupture, or an exception to the history of capitalism and colonialism, and indeed of bourgeois democracy. When it comes to Black critiques of fascism, they are usually fixed within two historical moments. The first is, as Naomi pointed out last night and this morning, the moment of capital F fascism, the Europe of the 1930s. This period is marked by the defeat of the Republicans in Spain and the rise of Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany. The story of the Black response is well known. It is a story of the mobilization of the African American volunteers in Spain through the Lincoln Brigades with the support of people like Paul Paul Robeson, who was a frequent visitor to Vancouver, the organization of protests against the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in London by C.L.R. James and George Padmore and Amy Ashwood Garvey and others through the International African Service Bureau, and the response to the Nazis of Scottsboro mother Ada Wright and George Padmore and others. The second moment occurs at the beginning of the 1970s in the United States in the context of the Vietnam War, the FBI war against the Black Panther Party, the intensification of the carceral state, the Attica prison rebellion, and the emergence of black capitalism as an attempt to co-opt black rebellion, and against the backdrop of intensifying armed struggle against colonialism in Africa. The most prominent black anti-fascist figure in this moment is Soledad brother George Jackson, assassinated by San Quentin prison guards on August 21st, 1971, which is why we have Black August, whose letters and speeches from prison have become almost classical statements on fascism. Indeed, Jackson, in a recording made before his death and played at his memorial service and printed in the Black Panther Intercommunal News Service, argues that fascism history can be traced to the emergence of monopoly capitalism and of capital's control of the state. Jackson's analysis allows us to understand then why black radicals were writing about fascism not only in the 1930s and 1970s, but also in the 1950s and 1960s, and in the 1980s and 1990s. Indeed, in Black communists Benjamin Davis and Claudia Jones, they wrote about fascism in the 1950s, responding in part to forms of anti-communist domestic repression in the US. Meanwhile, in 1975, the Afro-Puerto Rican anarchist Martin Sostre wrote a response to the actions of the Symbionese Liberation Front titled Armed Struggle, Natural Response to Fascism. In 1979's Anarchism and the Black Revolution, Lorenzo Camboa Irvin centers a critique of fascism. And in 1981, the late socialist historian Manning Marable published a two-part essay titled The Prospects for Fascism in the New Journal and Guide, the long-standing black newspaper from Norfolk, Virginia. Marable, again, argues for the continuity of fascism, seeing a line of fascist emergence from the Carter to the Reagan administration. There are additional examples from other eras, but I think you get the point. For black radicals, there is indeed a long arc of fascism. But the larger point here is that for black folk living in both the white settler colonies of North America as well as the formal colonies of Africa and the Caribbean, the conditions of extreme racism, super exploitation and monopoly capital, and a totalitarian state where the law is weaponized and state violence is the first order of social and political control, these conditions are nothing new. To these conditions, we should also mention the repression of free speech and the saturation of the intellectual realm from the education system to the media by the ideology of white supremacy. And on the question of white supremacy, there are a number of approaches and debates. We can say with certainty that when we talk about white supremacy, we are not talking about individual gestures or interactions. We are not interested in the localization of racism in an individual, although certainly it is on an individual level that white supremacy is most legible and most experienced. But is white supremacy a byproduct of capitalism, a tool used to divide the working class? Does white supremacy predate capitalism, becoming in fact the cause of racial slavery? Or does white supremacy emerge as a consequence of slavery, its existence expanding after emancipation to ensure the system of black exploitation and white rule continues after slavery has formally ended? 2 points are critical here. First, we must call it white supremacy, not racism, a term that multiculturalizes and individualizes a structural project. Second, the current moment is in part a crisis of white supremacy, the dying fight of a global order that has had 500 years of dominance, but that dominance is basically over, but it will not go down without a fight. Now, as a footnote, in the US, the rabid responses against affirmative action, against so-called diversity, equity, inclusion, etc., all of these, I would say, and the kind of rise of the nut jobs in the current administration in the US is part of a counter-revolution to the Ferguson uprising. And in some ways, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, while having great grassroots origins, was a sign of the total co-option of the Ferguson uprising. and then the counter-revolution against it. In any case, the conditions I've described were the normal conditions of Jim Crow in the US South, and also of apartheid South Africa, and also of the urban ghettos, as they were called, of the North. It is also the normal conditions of colonial rule by the British, French, and the Portuguese in Africa and the Caribbean. Indeed, while the question of colonial fascism is often discussed in relation to George Padmore and others in the 1930s, it returns in discussions of the Portuguese in Southern Africa in the 1970s. One thing that is important here is to recognize the historical dialectic between metropole and colony, as George Padmore, C.L.R. James, Amy Césaire, Eric Williams, W.E.B. Du Bois in The World and Africa, as we've just seen, Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, and others have argued, it was the wealth extracted from the colonial world, from the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the British colony of Jamaica, the Belgian colony of the Congo, that made the wealth of Europe possible. But that extraction could only occur through the most violent forms of labor exploitation in the form of slavery. That is, the conditions of colonialism abroad were provided the prototype for fascism at home. Let me conclude by saying a few words about violence and the uses of anti-violence by black writers, of anti-fascist violence by black writers. Again, there is a long arc here. Claude McKay's famous poem, If We Must Die, which has been repurposed of late, offered stark and uncompromising call to self-defense, composed as a response to the wave of white terrorist violence, the fascist violence against blacks that swept the United States during the Red Summer of 1919. Frantz Fanon famously understood decolonization as always a violent phenomena. Both Robert F. Williams and Malcolm X advocated for black self-defense against white attacks. Martin Sostre saw violence as one of a range of tactics to use against fascism. In Anarchism and the Black Revolution, Lorenzo Camboa Irvin advocated for the right to armed self-defense and the need for direct action. It should go without saying that this is not a call for wanton violence. Instead, Irvin draws on the likes of Malcolm X and Spanish anarchist Buenaventura Durruti to promote both the autonomous defense of black communities and proactive action against racist violence. Fascism is not to be debated, wrote Durruti, it is to be smashed. Following this, Irvin dismisses those liberal coddlers who have argued that the principles of free speech demand that the Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, and other far-right political forces have a civic right to express themselves. Instead, Irvin argues that while these organizations may seem small, their growth potential is massive, and they often have the ideological support of conservative leaders, economists, philosophers, sociologists, and other academics who have rationalized and organized the implementation of white supremacy through racist tax regimes, the gutting of social services, and the crushing of municipalities by debt and financial encumbrance. Direct action against fascism is necessary, writes Irvin, and the fascists must be fought on both the ideological front and in the streets. Finally, let me leave you with the words of the great African-American writer Langston Hughes. In 1943, Hughes wrote A Note to All Nazis, Fascists, and Klansmen, a poem published in the book Jim Crow's Last Stand. Hughes wrote, "You delight, so it would seem, at making mincemeat of my dream. If you keep on, before you're through, I'll make mincemeat out of you." Thank you very much.